Welcome to the Creation Gospel, and this is the series, The Spirit-Filled Family. We are working out of Creation Gospel Workbook 3, and we've made our way through the Spirit-Filled Husbands, the Spirit-Filled Children, the Spirit-Filled Singles, and now we're working on these Spirit-Filled Wives. And in the last couple of programs, we talked about things like spiritual authority and what it means to have your head covered, and what is the relationship of this symbol of authority maybe to the snake in the garden, and what is the connection to Jacob and Esau, and what does it mean to be fallen. And in the last program we read through 1 Corinthians 11. We read through part of it, and it was very specific in that Paul is writing to the Corinthians concerning the behavior basically of both men and women. We were focusing, because we're focusing on the Spirit-Filled Wives in this segment of the series, but as we saw, as is the case with Paul, as is the pattern with Paul, he will address both parties in the marriage, and he'll, at the beginning, as we were reading, as it said, well, we'll just read it again. He says that the man does not originate from the woman, but woman from the man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for man's sake. All right? And then he says, in typical Paul fashion, he'll equal it out. He'll say, however, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man through the woman. And all things originate from God. All right? So he's following this pattern that we've been studying in the series. He'll try to teach something through a gender role, or maybe a family role. But then he'll turn right around and he'll emphasize the equality, the counterbalance between the two roles. And as we said, it appears as though 1 Corinthians 11 is talking about two different topics, because it seems like he's talking about the instructions that he's given to men and women for their behavior within the fellowship or the congregation in terms of public prayer or publicly prophesying. It had specifically to do with the coverings of the head and symbols of authority. But as we read on through that passage, where it seemed to change topics, and it starts talking about the Lord's Supper, and he appears to be referring specifically to Passover assembly, he's not really changing themes. He might be changing the example for his theme, but he's really keying on the same thing, emphasizing the equality between the two roles in terms of their function and the balance that is needed between the two in their roles. He will go on and he will emphasize this same theme as it relates to how they are entering into this Passover meal. And so as he's wrapping up, let's start with verse 17, because he's just wrapped up with a statement there about the women having long hair, which is their glory, and the men not having the long hair. In verse 17, he says, but in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. Right? See, he's really not changed themes. He's talking about the difference between men and women in terms of prayer or prophesying, but he's also emphasizing they're the same. He says, in the Lord. And so they both have that function. It's just how you function within that role of public worship. that there are cultural and gender differences, but nevertheless they are both called to pray and prophesy within the congregation. And so now he goes on and he's talking about divisions again. Whereas with the male and the female, he's not pointing these divisions or difference between the male and the female as a negative thing. Now he seems to be moving where he says these differences that you're having in this other situation, these he's identifying as a negative thing, even though it's a positive thing, because the division is going to point out basically whose behavior will be approved. And he says, for there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. In other words, people are telling him who they are. And that's what we, when we were talking in Creation Gospel Workbook 1, that series, the message to Ephesus, it's talking about proving the apostles, testing the apostles. And that's what Moses and Aaron had to do with Pharaoh's magicians, because they could, at the beginning, duplicate some miracles. But if you keep testing and keep testing against the truth, then eventually those false prophets or those false apostles will tell you who they are. They will begin to make some mistakes. And Paul is apparently saying within this congregation, the actual formation of the factions has been an opportunity for people's character to actually be proven to him. And he says, therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this, I will not praise you. All right. That's a transition, and in the rest of the passage from verse 23 down to verse 34, he goes on and he continues a line of rebuke against the Corinthians who were coming together to eat. It appears to be a Passover meal. Some might argue that it's, some sort of oneg celebration, that it's kiddush. It might be any number of things. That's not our point here. We're not going to try to deconstruct which actual meal that he's talking about. It appears to be a Passover meal. But he's saying that there are people, the richer people who have more, who can provide more for themselves. They will come into this festive meal, and they will go ahead and they will eat and they drink, and they have plenty. But they have poorer brothers and sisters who come into the festive meal who have less, and they're going hungry and thirsty. And see, the point of this festive meal is not to be a glutton. It's not to just basically pig out, if we want to use that term, and enjoy the food. Because remember, what we've been talking about, what's the difference between physical food and spiritual food? Well, they're teamed up. So that you begin to ask the questions about the spiritual food, he gives you the physical food. Just like with the creation, he gave you the physical creation so that you would ask questions about the spirit behind the creation. What about that spirit that was moving on the face of the waters? The physical's revealed first, and then the spiritual. But apparently, there are those within this congregation who are focused, and they believe that this celebratory meal, this meal of worship, this holy meal, can actually be engaged simply to gratify yourself, when the whole goal of a festive meal within the holy times, within the Moedim, within Shabbat, is to make sure that the person next to you also has enough to have joy in Shabbat, to have joy in the Moed. And Paul is saying, if you have come together and you have failed to distinguish because he's poor, you're setting him lower. In other words, you are disrespecting him. Remember, to respect someone or to reverence someone, you have to elevate that person from their present position. You may have to lower yourself relative to that person in order to render them respect, because you're lending value to that person. And he's saying, when you're coming to eat this festive meal, you are disrespecting those who don't have enough, and therefore you are basically respecting yourself. You are elevating yourself relative to your brother. Because see, he's saying, in the Lord, we're all the same. He's trying to refocus them, saying the spiritual food should be the goal. You're coming in here and you're eating physical food with a view toward that physical food being a vehicle to carry you into spiritual realms, the deepest levels of worship, because Paul says the Torah is spiritual. These aren't just Passover commandments, these are physical commandments concerning the Pesach in order to bring you into the spiritual commandment of Pesach so that it's complete and entire in your life. Without the spirit of the Torah, it's empty. The commandment itself is empty. So these richer members of the congregation, by disrespecting their brothers, devaluing, they're actually violating the whole spirit of the feast. The spirit of the feast, it constantly emphasizes in the Torah. Count how many times the children of Israel are told to love the ger, to love the stranger. All right, not to mistreat the stranger. And so he's saying this feast is actually to bring us all, rich or poor, male, female, no matter who, no matter what our role, no matter what our gender, no matter what our career, no matter what kind of family we were born into. In Yeshua, it's not like this at the table. It's like this. So you see, he really hasn't changed subjects in chapter 11. Whereas, he's saying, this is the role of the man, and this is the role of the woman. And he's saying the woman came from the man. But then he said the man is through the woman. So what is he saying? Well, then all things are in the Lord. All things are from God. So he's using this as an example to make one point, but he's using this as an example to make another point. But the conclusion of his point making is that it should end up like this. There again, Paul always emphasizing the equal yoke, which is actually revolutionary for his day. Because we know it was very common for those who had more to look down on the poor. That's what, in the book of James, he's rebuking some believers because the poorer ones come in and they won't give them a seat. They'll say, sit down here at my feet. What is that doing? It's disrespecting. It's not having that spirit of reverence. Because this is the reverence of Adonai. And if you have proper reverence of Adonai, there's no way you're going to disrespect his people. Remember Yeshua? You have to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The spirit of reverence is that great equalizer. And the beautiful thing, as we look at this menorah as a pattern, we know that this is the most general expression of the Holy Spirit. This is called the Ruach Adonai. And if you remember the actual construction of the original menorah, it was one piece of beaten gold. In other words, these 6 branches here were beaten out of, or formed out of, this central piece. So everything is originating from this central piece of metal, fine metal. All right, now, these will become specific manifestations of the Holy Spirit, of the Ruach HaKodesh. Right? So you have wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and reverence. Right, now look at the structure of this menorah. If we say this is the original piece, these specific expressions of the Spirit branch out of that central pillar of the Holy Spirit, what we see over here, Yirat Adonai, the reverence of Adonai, it is basically an equivalent expression to what we see in this middle pillar. Because as you studied in the Creation Gospel Workbook 1, this 4, this Dalet, this number, represents authority, spiritual authority. The fourth day of creation, the sun and the moon, they were created to govern, to rule. Judah was fourth in birth order. He's given the scepter. All right. So we looked at those patterns of the 4 as being symbols of authority. And so when you see the number 4 in your mind, you can just go ahead and say thematically, it's giving me a message of spiritual authority. But didn't we also say the same was true of the 7th day? As we went through some concepts in the last program, we said the spirit of reverence is about authority. Because in order to respect someone, remember, you have to elevate them, to give them a certain degree of authority over you. You voluntarily lower yourself. When you elevate someone else, your position relative to that person is lower. And we said, remember, as they're speaking on submission, Peter and Paul both, they still talk about unity. And then when we looked at the word, we realized submission is voluntary, an attitude of voluntary cooperation. I choose to. Not I'm afraid if I don't, but I choose to. So in the structure of the menorah, whereas this actually is everything, everything came out of the 4. If we look at the 7, this is also symbolic of everything. So we call that an equivalent expression. If you look at 4s and 7s in Scripture, they will have some aspect of equivalent expression. Just like you need only 4 horses to represent 7 seals. Why? Because it's chiastic. This menorah, if we actually hinge it and fold it on itself, it becomes a chiastic structure. And that's why we say the spirit of reverence is the beginning of all wisdom. Why? Because they spring from the same source down here on the central pillar. And that's what you'll see thematically is the 2 branches that come from the same source thematically, they're going to have something in common. All right. Well, the same thing here. If we look, what about the 4? Where is there an equivalent expression for what's going on with this fullness of the Holy Spirit right here? Everything came out of it. Well, the same thing can be said of the 7, because the 7 represents the fullness of everything as well. There's an establishment of 6 steps, and then the 7th step, everything is actually done by the conclusion of the 6th. The only thing that's left here is the creation of rest. And so in that, you can see that thematically, they're very similar. All right? So authority, but this also represents authority. All right? Just like Yeshua, the 4th position, the one in the middle, Yeshua is identified as the one in the midst of the lampstand. Why? Because on him, all 7 spirits of Adonai rested. Right? To him is given authority over the nations. You can see that in the message to the 4th church, Thyatira, that he's given authority. So that is that symbol. But authority, the Yirat Adonai, the respect of Adonai, because I cannot have respect with him without commensurately respecting his people, if that makes sense. So what Paul's saying here is very relevant when he's rebuking the Corinthians for these richer brothers to elevate themselves in terms of seating. And so Yeshua taught him, he said, don't seat yourself in the best seat, take the worst seat. And then, when the host comes in, he may move you up. What is he saying? Respect other people. Respect the position of other people, and leave it to the Father to promote you. If you have more, And what does he say? Give something to one who has less. Elevate your believing brother so that he doesn't feel disrespected, and you in turn aren't filled with pride because you were aiming your own respect at yourself. It wasn't meant to self-serve. Respect was meant to serve others, meant to serve the Father, and meant to serve your neighbor, your brothers and your sisters in faith. And so by starting with this pattern between the men and the women who are praying and prophesying within the congregation publicly, and what is the proper procedure, what is the proper dress, what is the most respectful way to enter into the congregation, so that the plans of Adonai are respected utmost. But then there's an acknowledgement there are differences between the genders, especially in dress. But this does not affect the spiritual power of either the male or the female. And so on the exterior, you dress appropriately. But in terms of delivering the prophecy or the prayer, what he's saying is those prayers are equally effective. In fact, he says if you're married and you're in contention with your spouse, it says even your prayers are hindered because you're one with that person. It's expressing the co-equal relationship as he's moving through his example text. And then as he moves into the Passover, he's moving the same principle over to the rich and the poor within the Passover celebration. And he's saying if you refuse to do this, then you're actually eating and drinking judgment on yourself, because this is a holy meal. If you are eating and drinking to serve yourself and you're simply functioning in the physical realm to fulfill the commandment, then you're eating and drinking judgment on yourself, because the point of it was to bring us all in spiritual realms to the same level. That's what a feast is all about. Stranger, alien, orphan, widow, you provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. And that is the spirit of the Torah. That is the mercy of the Torah. That is the justice of the Torah. And that is the faithfulness of the Torah. And you cannot settle for simply checking off a box of a physical commandment. So he's really not changed topics here. He says, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone's hungry, let him eat at home. All right? And that's what he's saying. If you want to serve yourself, leave that at the house. But when you come into a holy congregation, it is your obligation to elevate, to respect the one who has less, and to provide for that person. Even in Israel today, if you go out shopping on Friday mornings, there are those sometimes who have less who might sit down on the curb with a bag. And those who come out of the supermarket will look and they will drop things into that bag to make sure that that person's family has enough to celebrate that Shabbat. And that's the true spirit of Shabbat. That is the true spirit of reverence, is we're all going to sit down at the same time and we're all going to enjoy our Shabbat meal together. No one is left out. When we come in to pray together, no one is left out. There's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek. But according to the Jewish law that Paul has passed on to them, are there decencies and issues of order that need to be observed? Yes, definitely. Number one, he's saying don't cross-dress in the congregation. I should be able to tell a male from a female. And you know, sometimes within Messianic congregations, people are all caught up in the symbols of Judaism, but sometimes they actually disregard some of the instructions concerning dress. And so it's important sometimes to reevaluate, am I wearing symbols of dress that would apply specifically to a man? In other words, normally when I look at this object, was it made for a man? Or was this object made for a woman? Sometimes you can see this with talits. Sometimes we need to go reevaluate. Sometimes we just buy a talit without knowing anything about it. But is it a male garment or a female garment? You know, sometimes you need to look at the patterns. I mean, what section of the catalog did you buy it from? Did you buy it from the men's section or the women's section? You know, some things, they're unisex. They really have no female or male aspect, and so it's not going to offend anyone. But there's certain things that Paul is saying when you come together, what you do in your own home, that's what he's saying. If you're hungry, eat at home. That's where you engage that. But when you come together in order for things to be decent, so that we understand that there's equality in the spirit, but in the physical realm, we still have gender differences, and we have to pay attention to those things, not to offend people. And his standard here, apparently, as he's opening the chapter, he's saying paradosis, the Jewish traditions, the Jewish oral law, that has been his guideline. And setting up the standards of modesty and decency within the congregation of believers. And so, as we look at verse 10 of chapter 11, and we'll do that in the next segment more deeply, but what we're going to see is 1 Corinthians 11, it appears to be very straightforward in terms of wear this on your head, don't wear this on your head, your hair should be this length, it should be that length, but whatever the local custom is, pay attention to that. You don't want to violate and offend local custom, which again is coming out of Jewish law. It's a principle of minchag, and minchag means Jews in one area might have certain customs, say as it pertains to Passover, but Jews from another area might have different customs as it relates to Passover. They're still fulfilling the commandments, but how they go through the process, maybe within the Seder or in their Haggadah, it might be a little bit different. And so the principle of minchag says, you observe the custom of the place where you are now. You don't take the custom from over here, and if you move over here, try to impose on this group what you did over there. And that has some relevance, I think, for Messianic communities, when we're trying to hold on to old things and then impose them on the new. We'll look at it a little bit more in the next segment.
Hey everybody, this is Daniel McGurr with Ancient Covenant Ministries, and I'd like to have you consider donating to HRN because everything that goes on here is based basically off of your donations. And not only does your donations help you able to watch these programs, but it also helps the message to go forth around the world and to allow other people to watch. So I ask you to consider donating your money to the station if you can, and if you can't, that's fine too. But please consider donating to HRN. Thank you.
Welcome back. As we were saying before the break, a lot of times in what we would call a Messianic congregation, although I'm kind of interested as to what exactly that is, because if you go to different fellowships or congregations where people are studying Torah and keeping the feasts, what you find is there are no two exactly alike. There really doesn't seem to be any minchag in terms of groups. It's more like from specific congregation to specific congregation. These are the ways that we do things. And so with Jews, I mean, basically at this period, you don't have a huge number of different groups that might be doing different things. You've got Beit Shammai, the school of Shammai. You've got Beit Hillel, the school of Hillel. You have the Essenes. You've got, you got the Sadducees, but really there's not going to be a huge diversity in practice. You'll tend to see more diversity in practice in geographic location of where Jews were. The Sephardic customs, you can see there's a lot more difference in the way that they would engage things like the Passover Seder. And so, even if you observe this Jewish law of minchag, that I need to observe like the community where I live, in terms of Messianic congregations, that's still a problem. because it's like every single congregation is different. And so you may have done it this way at this congregation or this fellowship, but over here it's something different. Well, if we're carrying on with Paul's teaching, passing on Jewish tradition, and we say, well, the minchag is this way, then it makes sense if I move to this congregation that I need to voluntarily cooperate with that congregation and not try to remake them in the image of this other one. I'm actually engaging something brand new when I do that, and I have to come into that congregation with that mindset. I'm going to learn from the beginning. Now, if at any point you feel like you're violating or transgressing a specific express commandment of the Torah, then you're going to have to rethink. But in terms of just how we do it or how we're reading this passage, you're going to see some differences. And so it's up to you as the newcomer coming in. If you don't understand some things, or this is different, or I would prefer to do it the old way, or my kids are used to doing it the old way, well, it goes back to what is submission. It is a voluntary attitude of cooperation. And so what you have to do, my expectations might be here, but then I have to respect the leadership in place in this local community, in this congregation, and I have to fit in with what they are doing. Sometimes that might mean that I do extra things at home. Like Paul is saying, if you're hungry, eat at home. But when you come together, the focus is on unity, not the way I prefer to do it, not what fits my taste buds. I mean, you can even see that in praise and worship in Messianic congregations, because so many of us came out of church backgrounds, and even within those church backgrounds, there was a huge diversity in practice. What constituted a worship service? What were the expectations? And so in all that huge mix, we're coming together and trying to worship together, and we're each bringing baggage in from different denominations. If we're coming in from the synagogue, obviously there's expectations from someone who would come in from a synagogue, and Paul's expectation was that, what did he say? I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, the paradoses. That's Jewish law, Jewish custom, just as I delivered them to you. So he's taking Jewish law and trying to somehow adjust it to a Gentile, primarily Gentile congregation. And so that's your job. And he's teaching in this whole chapter. In fact, it continues. If we were to continue reading in chapter 12, we would see that he's continuing his theme. Because, and even chapter 12, he says, even as the body is one and yet has many members, all are members of the body, though they are many, are one body, and so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. He's continuing his theme. He's using the relationship between the male and the female, publicly praying and prophesying. He's talking about coming together for a Passover meal and how we are to respect the poorer brother, wait for him, provide for him. And he's continuing even in the use of spiritual gifts. And as he starts talking about spiritual gifts, again, he's saying neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek. We are different. This person is a Jew, this person is a Greek. This is a male, this is a female. And that's why I say, don't cross-dress. Don't try to confuse the issue and make yourself out to be a man if you're a woman. And don't dress up like a woman or try to pass yourself off as a woman if you're a man. Be who you are. And that's what he said previously is, remain in the condition in which you were called. Don't try to change your gender. Don't try to change your ethnicity. But in terms of how we're reading the commandments, he's passing on Jewish tradition to the Gentiles. He's not trying to change them into Jews. He's trying to apply a rule structure so that the praise and worship remains decent and orderly, and so that the goals of the congregation can be met apart from chaos. And we can see why in our day and age, because we bring all these different expectations of what a praise and worship service should be, and we all think our way is right because it's the way we did it. But there is no right. It's a mixture. Like Paul's trying to put some sort of, order to this chaos. We're doing the same thing in our generation. We're trying to put order to chaos. And those people who come in and insist on doing it the way that they did over there are being disruptive. He would call those people out the same way he's calling these people out at the Passover meal. And he's saying, we're one body. And he's saying, in order to guide this thing, let's go back to Jewish practice and see if we can make it a good guideline. Obviously, he's not opposing Jewish law and everything. But in some things, and how they are conducting their worship services, and how they're celebrating the Moedim, he's saying these are important things. It's going to help maintain order. So you might come into a Messianic congregation and, you love the contemporary praise and worship. And if you love contemporary Christian praise and worship, you're probably going to have a hard time with some of the more Hebraic, Jewish sounding or Middle Eastern sounding praise and worship. Or you may come from a place where you've always had the more Jewish type of modal within the praise and worship songs. You may have always done the Jewish liturgy from the Siddur. And so you're having a hard time. You're saying, why are you trying to bring the church into this? Well, that's the problem. There's really not a Paul out there who's saying, do it this way. Even though Paul is saying, I gave you the Jewish tradition, Paul didn't have CDs and television and all these other influences that make it so easy for us to maintain that contact within the church that we left behind. And so what we find is we're coming into this congregation and we're trying to remake that congregation in the familiar, the more comfortable modes of praise and worship that we came out of. And we're not willing to break that down and start anew and start afresh and say, you know what? This is a joint congregation. There's more than one person in this congregation than me. And what Paul is stressing here is, although we're all different, that we're all the same. Spiritually, we're all the same. And so there's no reason for me to insist on only contemporary Christian praise and worship, because I'm really trying to remake something that I left. I'm trying to remake it like it was. Why not start new? And that's not to say that you can't listen to contemporary praise and worship. A message is a message, regardless of what it sounds like. On the other hand, if you do it only that way, then you're really just trying to take this and put it in a new place, instead of allowing something fresh and new to form. It might be a mixture. You might have the more Hebraic forms of praise, worship, song, dance. You might incorporate some of the Jewish liturgy, because we can see that pattern here in the Corinthians, that Paul is passing on Jewish customs to them. But to what extent can a generation coming freshly out of the church acquire those traditions? Probably not very fast. If you knock away every support system that they've ever known, that's going to be difficult, because it's a learning process. We have to go at the pace of the nursing children. But as long as all the nursing children acknowledge that the goal is for us all to be equal in terms of our contribution, and even within that equality, it's possible to have levels of authority that we voluntarily, mutually submit to one another. That means we voluntarily cooperate with one another, and we lend respect to the role of that other person. And if the scripture is telling us the person can function in that role, then we absolutely allow that person to function in that role, and we quit trying to subdue them. Right? That's a problem. That's a unique problem for this generation. But Paul is saying, don't forget the spirit that brought us here. Don't be so invested in old ways of doing things. Like with the Corinthians, don't be so invested in your old pagan ways of doing things that I've got men in here that look like women. Right? Don't be so invested in pagan ways of doing things that I've got like these Corinthian, I don't know what you would call them, seers, coming in here and basically prophesying without any authority, with no validation whatsoever, trying to domineer over men. That's why they would actually go into this to be a priestess or a prophetess, to have a spiritual role within a pagan religion, because in that day and time, that was really the only path of power for a woman, was to take on those pagan roles within a pagan religion or temple. And so if they were after the power and used to wielding that power, he's saying you can't bring that into a holy congregation. You can't bring that into a holy assembly. You can't domineer over men. If that was your point in becoming this priestess over here in a pagan temple, you cannot bring that same motivation in here. If you are truly anointed of the Holy Spirit to prophesy or to pray in public, then it says, understand. Know your role. If you're a female, you're a female. You're no better, you're no worse. You have a different role. If you're a male, you're no better, you're not inferior. You have an equal role in the Spirit. Just don't forget who you are in the physical realm. And that's what it says in 1 Corinthians 11:10. If we looked at that whole chapter, we can see that it ends with a reference to a spring feast, Passover. But if we were to look at the beginning of the chapter, which we did, we read the entire portion dealing with how men and women function in their gifts within the congregation in terms of public prayer, public prophesying, speaking in the congregation. If we look at that specifically in his comparing the male and the female roles, he's making a lot of mystical may not be the word, he's making a lot of hints or allusions to the fall feasts. But, because remember, in the fall feasts, thematically, what we're looking at is it's a season of coverings. And it kind of revolves around this middle one here, which is Yom Kippur, literally a day of coverings. And so when he's talking about these coverings in chapter 11, what he's hoping to provoke in our minds are the themes that go with the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonements, and Sukkot, a season of coverings. And so in verse 10, he says, therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And that's kind of an interesting statement. A lot of people will argue over what does it mean because of the angels. They even argue about what that symbol of authority is. Is it her husband? Is it the actual fabric on her head itself? There's no shortage of opinions on what he means by symbol of authority or because of the angels. But remember, Paul's pattern is to address both the spiritual and the physical covering of a woman who prays or prophesies. Just like, previously he said, I'm talking to you about physical things, but this is actually, a mystery of Messiah and the body of Messiah. He calls it the church. All right? So he said, I teach you in a physical way, but I'm wanting you to transfer it to the spiritual realm. And I think verse 10 is absolutely, it unmistakably draws us into the spiritual realm when he mentions angels, where he says if a woman is going to speak publicly within the congregation, if she's going to pray or she's going to prophesy, she needs that symbol, and a symbol would be a sign, something visible on her head because of the angels. And so what is he alluding to? Well, a symbol of authority, if we think of good examples, Esther goes to the king and he holds out a scepter. And that scepter is simply a physical object that represents, I receive you. I authorize you to come into my presence and to make a petition. What Tamar took from Judah was his seal, his cord, and his staff. All three of those were signs of a husband's authority. Even though he believes she's a temple prostitute, he gives her his seal, his cord, and his staff. These are things that say, this is my signature. This is my authorization. In essence, he gave her a blank check. I mean, fill in the amount. And that's what the king did with Esther when he gives her his ring and says, write something that can nullify this vow that I sent out. I can't bring the words back, but I will let you and Mordecai write something after me that might nullify the ill effect of that foolish decree. Right? So, blank check. Whatever you write in here, Esther, just sign my name to it. It's the same as if I wrote it. It's like it came from my own hand when I give you this sign of authority. All right, the same thing with Tamar. Judah is giving her a blank check. I mean, he didn't just give her one thing that testified to his authority. He didn't just give her 2 witnesses of his authority. He gave her 3 witnesses of his authority. His personal seal, that cord, and then the staff that would be unique to him as a patriarch. And so she has the sign of a husband's authority even though he doesn't know he's married her in a levirate marriage. And so these are visible things. See, when Judah's ready to have her put to death, she pulls out these signs of authority and says, look at this. If she had nothing visible to pull out for people to look at, it's just, I mean, it's still in the spiritual realm. But by taking that physical object out, that physical seal, that physical cord, that physical staff, by holding out the physical scepter, anybody standing around, including the angels, can say, oh, this husband is authorizing this wife to act on his behalf. And that's what Judah, when he sees these signs, he says, she's more righteous than I am. I gave her a blank check. You know, she basically deceived me into doing the right thing. And so with that visible sign, Paul is making this transfer here. He's teaching us about spiritual things. Tamar and Judah came into an actual spiritual union, whether they understood it or not, because you have to look at the offspring. You have to look at the line of Messiah coming out of that union. Right? And so by presenting this visible sign, the king or Judah, and there's any number of other examples out there of a husband or a king giving to his wife that symbol of authority. And Paul is saying in our generation, in our culture, in our religion, at this stage of our history, when you see a woman with her head covered, first of all, you know she's married. And then, second of all, the sign is telling you that she is under her husband's authority, that she is in that partnership and she is acting on his behalf in that marriage. That she's not acting independently of his authority. They are one. See the pattern? He never lets you just say, it's this way and you submit. He says, no, it's mutual. All right? And so when Esther does what she does, she's not an independent agent of her husband. She is authorized by her husband even though it might appear she's writing independently, because he trusts her. Whatever she writes, it's the same as if he wrote it. And so Paul is saying when the women in the congregation, if their heads are covered, it's a physical sign. The sign itself doesn't make it a true or untrue prophecy. You still have to test the words of the prophets. But he's saying in the exterior, in the physical realm, any man or woman can look at this woman who's praying or prophesying in the congregation. Any spiritual being, any angel can look at this woman, see the sign of authority on her head, and say, this woman is functioning in her spiritual gift under the authority of her husband with full authorization. He has given her a blank check to act on his behalf in the marriage. And so, if you have a problem with her, you have a problem with him. She acts on his behalf. They are in unity of mind, they're in unity of spirit, as well as in unity of body. It's the women who would remove the sign of authority from their heads that you pretty well knew were fallen women, that they were available, pretty much sexually to you, to another male, but they were also vulnerable spiritually, because the two things go together. And so when Paul is teaching, he's very consistent with this pattern. When you see something physical on this woman's head, then understand she's working under her husband's authority. He's not in disagreement with what she's doing. In the same way, he talks about the man and his head, right? In terms of him being the image of Elohim. The glory, that physical aspect that you see him as he works in the Spirit, that he is reflecting the authority of Messiah. The same way that Messiah reflects the authority of the Father. And that's what Yeshua said. The Father is going to give authority to me, and I in turn am going to give authority to you. That's what he says to the Thyatirans. If you will obey me, if you will be found spiritually pure when these seals are opened, then the authority that has been passed on to my head will be passed on to yours. In the same way, the husband and the wife. And see, Paul is teaching in these levels of authority, because when you have been given that authority, you are acting on behalf of the other. It's the same thing with Yeshua. We know that he does not speak apart from the Father. He only does what he sees the Father do. He only says what he hears the Father say. Therefore, he has the authority of the Father like that blank check. Whatever Yeshua says, he is speaking for the Father, because his will is the will of the Father. And when you see this man praying or prophesying, he is speaking consistently with the words of Yeshua, who is the word of the Father. He's speaking under authorization. He's not speaking apart from that authority. And Yeshua has given him that signed check that says, you take this word of encouragement to the congregation, and it's as though I had said it myself. And then in the same thing in the pattern, when you see this woman with this sign on her head, it's that the husband agrees that this message has come down from heaven to my wife, and she is speaking because she is counterbalanced and co-equal with me in the Spirit. It doesn't mean she is me, but she is. She's one, but it doesn't mean she is him. But see, we're all drinking from the same Spirit, right? He doesn't drink for her. I mean, you can't drink water for another person. That person has to drink the water for themselves. And that's what he said. We're many, but we're all drinking from one Spirit. And so from the Spirit that she has been drinking in, she is in turn going to prophesy. She is going to speak in the congregation. And because I know the source of that prophecy, I know that the word and the water that she is feeding from, when she prays or prophesies publicly in the congregation, she does it with a signed blank check from me, because I am in full agreement with her. And I am also in a position, if I doubt the source of that prayer, if I doubt the source of that prophecy, if I doubt the source of that word of exhortation that she might speak to the congregation, because Torah is prophecy, by the way. If I doubt the source of that, then I am her counterbalance. And there again, that mutuality with the spouses, you're there to help one another, to be an Azer Kenegdo. So let's go back and let's re-examine this thing. Are you sure this is a message that you need to bring forth? But I provide the counterbalance to her, and she provides the counterbalance to me. And when we are one in Messiah, we are in that yoke, co-equal, counterbalance, each functioning distinctly in our roles as a man or a woman within the body, then we are free to operate within our gifts in the body, each of us under proper authority. Everything decently and everything in order according to the scriptures. And that's a blessing. See you next time.